Sometimes days that seemed destined to be remembered as celebrations turn into a cruel ordeal. Hannah, 32, had arrived at her sister Lydia's wedding carrying a mixture of pride at seeing her family reunited and a knot in her stomach she couldn't untie. For years, she had been treated as a lost cause, the single woman who hadn't achieved either the social position or the romantic trophies the family considered indispensable. While Lydia shone in a lace dress and a smile that seemed rehearsed in front of the mirror, Hannah was relegated to the back table right next to the kitchen door, where the bustle of waiters with china trays made her feel invisible, and at the same time displayed as an example of failure. The tablecloth on that table was different, without the orchid centerpiece that adorned the others, and the murmur of plates and cutlery mingled with the barely concealed comments of some guests. It was as if everything had been planned. Godmother Marian, with her sweet perfume, and her smile that concealed poison, approached from time to time with questions that didn't seek answers, but rather sought to confirm her role as poor Hannah. The photographers also seemed like unwitting accomplices, asking her several times if she had come with a man, and using their cameras to record the discomfort etched on her face. Comments floated like poisoned arrows. A woman with an exaggerated hat suggested aloud that women who are too independent scare men away, while another condescendingly recommended that she attend church groups to find decent people. Hannah smiled automatically, but inside, she felt each word sinking in more deeply. That table, the one for the rejected, was a cold setting, and even the teenage cousin who only cared about counting how many sandwiches he could steal served as a mirror of what her family expected of her, to be an ornament that confirmed Lydia's superiority. When the bouquet was announced, the murmur in the room transformed into a kind of morbid anticipation. Lydia, from the center of the floor, looked for Hannah like someone aiming at a marked target. The entire room seemed to know what was coming, a spectacle disguised as tradition. The bouquet flew in a perfect, almost choreographed arc, and landed just a few feet from Hannah, as if shame itself had been flung at her feet. Laughter erupted, murmurs became more audible, and even a couple of phones captured the moment with the swiftness of someone smelling blood in water. Hannah instinctively stepped back, colliding with the corner of the table, and the ribbon of the bouquet got caught in the button of her dress, forcing her into an awkward scene that the room enjoyed as if it were cheap comedy. The photographer, attentive, fired a burst of flashes that immortalized the awkwardness. At that moment, Hannah felt the air escape from her lungs. The gazes surrounded her, no longer as passive observers, but as witnesses to a cruel spectacle designed to remind her of her place, the 30-something single woman, the human reminder of what should not be. Her heart pounded, shame burned like hot coals on her skin, and the feeling of being in a shop window with no way out became suffocating. It was right there, amid the echo of laughter and the metallic sound of cutlery against plates, when an unexpected voice, deep and calm, leaned over her with a phrase that seemed straight out of another script. "Act like you're with me." Hannah looked up and found William, a tall guest with a serene gaze and a confident expression, Richard's own cousin, who had approached with the casualness of someone who enters to put out a fire unannounced. That was the moment everything began to change. William didn't hesitate for a second. With an almost imperceptible movement, he removed the tangled ribbon from Hannah's dress and, without giving her time to protest, sat down next to her as if he had always belonged at that table. His presence changed the air. The murmur in the background died away, and suddenly the passing waiters stopped looking at Hannah with automatic pity. He rested his arm on the back of his chair with convincing familiarity, and while exchanging a few trivial words, he did so in a tone audible enough for the nearby tables to realize he was no ordinary stranger. His gestures were studied, but executed with the naturalness of an actor who doesn't act, but embodies. Hannah, surprised, could only play along, feeling Marian's inquisitive gaze tense across the room. The next move was even bolder. William took Hannah's hand as if it had been an everyday gesture and invited her to get up to dance. On the dance floor, amid waltzes that seemed recycled from other weddings. Their steps were synchronized, and the contrast between the previous discomfort and the current confidence was so evident that many stopped looking at Lydia to look at them. The same guests who had previously whispered about the old maid began exchanging approving glances, as if an invisible seal had changed color. Lydia, accustomed to handling the spotlight with surgical precision, immediately noticed that something was slipping from her grasp. Her rigid smile lost its luster when William, with a clear gesture, publicly confronted her by uttering a phrase directed at the group. "Funny to turn your sister's love life into wedding entertainment." The silence that followed was no coincidence. It was the exact sound of a room, understanding that the narrative had changed hands. William's improvised plan took shape with a naturalness that disarmed any resistance. At an opportune moment, he asked one of the organizers to discreetly move Hannah's seat, under the pretext that there was no point in separating close family. Within minutes, Hannah's chair appeared next to the central table, right in front of the eyes that had previously relegated her to the periphery. It was like a change of scenery in the middle of a play. The set was the same, but the positioning of the actors altered the entire script. The guests who had until then ignored her began to greet her with exaggerated smiles, some asking about her work at the publishing house, others commenting that they always knew she was brilliant. Hannah heard those words like someone hearing a distorted echo. They were the same lips that hours before had called her a poor old maid. Even Mrs. Wellington, the same woman who had suggested a church group, suddenly changed her tune upon learning William's last name. Now, with eyes sparkling with interest, she described her as a young woman with a lot of promise, while Hannah felt the irony pounding in her chest like a drum. It was a validation she knew was false, but at the same time it served as a mirror to what she'd been enduring all her life: cruelty disguised as advice, and condescension hidden behind polite smiles. Lydia watched from her bridal throne, jaw set, as the wedding narrative, which was supposed to revolve around her perfection, transformed into a spectacle where the sister she'd relegated to the corner shone at the center. Hannah took a deep breath, aware that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't on the defensive, but had an ally who knew exactly which buttons to push. The atmosphere reached a strange pitch of tension when the tradition of the garter came up. Many considered it a simple festive ritual, but at this wedding it carried an air of spectacle staged to reinforce hierarchies. Lydia, aware that the gazes were no longer fixed on her with the same devotion, tried to regain control by forcing laughter and prolonging the moment with sharp comments that barely concealed her discomfort. Then, when the garter flew through the air in an almost theatrical arc, it was William who caught it with a precision that seemed pre-scripted. Laughter, applause, and murmurs broke out like a wave, and the entire room turned its head toward Hannah, awaiting her reaction. With calculated calm, William approached her, bent down, and, following tradition, slipped the garter down Hannah's leg. The gesture, both intimate and public, ignited the room in cheers. The contrast was stark. Minutes ago, she had been mocked in the corner. Now, she was the center of positive attention at the very wedding that had been designed to portray her as a failure. Lydia, rigid in her chair, forced a smile, like someone watching a house of cards collapse before everyone's eyes. If you've made it this far, tell me where you're reading this from in the comments. I'd love to know and hope this story travels further than you can imagine. From that moment on, something changed not only in the perception of others, but in Hannah herself. The theater, which at first seemed like an improvised strategy to avoid humiliation, began to feel real, tangible. William wasn't acting as a simple temporary ally. His gestures were consistent, his words carried a weight. That didn't fit with the idea of a farce. When the music regained strength, he invited her to dance again. And with each turn, with each synchronized step, Hannah felt the mask of improvisation crumble to give way to something deeper. The confidence with which he guided her on the dance floor contrasted with the fragility she had felt minutes before, as if the physical space itself had changed texture and color. The guests, fascinated by the new narrative, approached them as if they were protagonists in an unexpected story. Compliments poured in, toasts were raised with knowing smiles, and even the photographers seemed more interested in capturing the connection between them than in Lydia's marriage itself. Hannah noticed how the mocking glances had transformed into recognition, and while she knew that recognition was based on superficiality and status, she also felt something else blossoming inside her, the certainty that she didn't need anyone's validation to exist with. Dignity. William's presence served as a reminder that the story Lydia had written for herself could be rewritten in real time, right there in front of everyone. The evening wore on, and while the couple attended to social engagements, Hannah and William became a sort of secondary focus of attention. The center table was no longer forbidden territory. There she shared conversation with people who previously wouldn't even look her in the eye. She surprised herself by responding calmly, without the trembling that usually accompanied every word when she felt judged. William intervened naturally, introducing her into the conversations as if she had always been part of their circle. At one point, even Richard himself came over to say hello, a gesture Lydia interpreted as a silent betrayal. Everything that had previously been designed to expose Hannah as a public failure was now shifting toward a spectacle of recovered dignity. The most intense moment, however, came outside the ballroom when William walked her to the parking lot, away from the lights and watchful eyes. There, amid the echoing footsteps and the fresh, early morning air, he stopped walking and looked at her with a seriousness that brooked no disguise. He confessed that the charade had long since ceased to be one, that what had begun as a gesture to protect her had ignited a real connection within him. Hannah listened to those words with her heart racing, as if all the noise of the party had been trapped behind the hotel doors. For the first time in years, someone wasn't speaking of her as a problem, a warning, or a burden, but as a possibility. Hannah remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. She was used to any gesture toward her being laced with ulterior motives, hidden mockery, or comments disguised as advice. But there was none of that in William's gaze, only a sincerity that she found disconcerting. The parking lot, with its yellowish streetlights and the distant echo of a taxi pulling away, seemed like an improvised stage where everything could be rewritten. She felt the contrast between the bustle of the living room, still vibrating behind the doors, and the silence of that corner where someone truly saw her. A mixture of fear and hope settled in her chest, because accepting his words meant defying not only her sister, but also the role the family had assigned her for years. William, aware of her bewilderment, didn't push her. He simply handed her a folded piece of paper with his number handwritten on it and said he wanted to see her again, not out of revenge, but because he really wanted to. Hannah held the paper as if it were heavier than a rock, sensing that a path she had never imagined lay within it. It wasn't a lifeline thrown out of pity, but an invitation to believe she could be the protagonist of her own story. As she walked toward her car, the paper tucked carefully in her palm, she realized that the true triumph of that evening wasn't having silenced Lydia or changed the guests' perceptions. It was having allowed herself, even for a moment, to imagine that she deserved something different. The days following the wedding were an emotional whirlwind for Hannah. Every time she recalled the bouquet scene, the rejects table, and the calculated laughter, she felt the same mixture of anger and shame. But immediately afterward came the image of William holding her hand on the dance floor, facing Lydia with a confidence she'd never dared to possess. That duality stayed with her for weeks, like a pendulum between an open wound and the possibility of something new. When she finally got up the courage to write to him, she discovered he was waiting for her, with the same calm with which he'd rescued her that night. Their first encounters were simple: a coffee in a downtown bookstore, a walk in the park, long conversations that didn't need to be disguised as a social spectacle. What was surprising was the ease with which William integrated into her daily life. There were no grand theatrical gestures, but small attentions that revealed genuine interest. Remembering the name of her favorite author, asking about the project at the publishing house, listening without interrupting when she talked about her insecurities. In contrast, Hannah's family continued to operate as usual. Lydia avoided mentioning William in public, and Marian clung to veiled comments about not getting her hopes up. But it no longer had the same effect. For the first time, Hannah felt that those judgments didn't define the value of her days. As the months passed, Hannah and William's relationship grew stronger, surprising even her. 3 months after their marriage, it was no longer just casual encounters or a game of appearances. They shared routines, projects, and even comfortable silences that spoke louder than any conversation. William supported her with small details Hannah had never imagined she would receive, accompanying her to a presentation at the publishing house, cooking for her when she returned late and tired, or simply waiting for her with a smile that disarmed the shadow of family criticism. Every day together was a reminder that the narrative written by Lydia and Marian wasn't the only one possible. Of course, the family was quick to react. Lydia, accustomed to being the absolute center of attention, began to show barely concealed resentment. Comments about fleeting relationships or dangerous illusions became frequent at family gatherings. Marian, true to her role, insisted that you shouldn't trust too much in someone who appears out of nowhere. But the curious thing was that these judgments no longer resonated deeply with Hannah. Surrounded by William's calm and conviction, she learned to see them for what they were: control mechanisms of a family that never accepted her independence. The difference now was that she had someone at her side who not only defended her, but also encouraged her to believe in her own voice. 6 months after that marriage, Hannah and William were already sharing a home. It wasn't a hasty decision, but the natural consequence of a relationship that grew with the patience of one who sows carefully. The apartment Hannah had previously shared with a friend was transformed into a shared space, full of small signs of life together: mismatched cups that William insisted on keeping, books open on the coffee table, and the habit of preparing breakfast together on Sundays, even though neither of them was a particularly good cook. This living together gave Hannah a sense of stability she had never experienced before, not because she depended on him, but because for the first time she felt someone had chosen her without conditions or comparisons. The family, however, saw this cohabitation as a threat to their control. Lydia tried to downplay it in public, saying it was a phase and that Hannah would soon return to reality. Marian, always faithful to her poisonous comments, claimed that William was only looking to have fun before committing to someone on his level. But this time, those words failed to break the shield Hannah had built. She learned to stop explaining, to stop justifying her happiness, and discovered the strength of strategic silence. She no longer needed to prove anything to them, because the life she was building was proof enough. With each criticism, all they achieved was to reinforce the conviction that she was at last living on her own terms. Exactly 1 year after that night when everything changed, Hannah returned to the same hotel, but this time in a completely different setting. William had prepared a discreet dinner, without excesses or an audience, with the sole intention of celebrating this symbolic anniversary. As they walked through the carpeted corridors, Hannah couldn't help but remember every corner: the table in the back, the untimely flashing lights, the muffled laughter. But now, William's hand intertwined with hers transformed those memories into scars that no longer hurt, but gave meaning to the present. In the room where they had danced for the first time, he knelt, took out a simple ring, and proposed to her, not with theatrical speeches, but with the same serenity with which he had rescued her that night. "I want this to stop being a coincidence and become an everyday choice." Hannah accepted with tears that weren't of shame, but of relief. This wasn't just about getting married, but about acknowledging that she had gone through a year of personal reconstruction. This proposal represented the most profound victory, proof that she no longer needed the approval of Lydia, Marian, or any other member of her family to feel whole. The irony was evident. The very scenario that had been planned to expose her as a failure became the birthplace of a new story, written by herself and shared with someone who never treated her like a hopeless cause. Shubiswai, revenge, she realized at that moment, was not to shout her triumph, but to live it in silence, certain that she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Hannah and William's wedding was the complete opposite of Lydia's ostentatious display. They chose a small garden, with warm lights strung between the trees and long tables that invited closeness rather than competition. There were no endless guest lists or choreography designed to impress. There were only the people who truly mattered in their lives. Hannah wore a simple, soft-lined dress that emphasized her serenity more than any ornamentation. There was calm in her eyes, a calm that contrasted with the nervous tremors she'd felt in that same hotel a year earlier. William, with a smile that seemed to contain an entire universe, didn't need grand speeches. His mere presence was a reminder that he'd been there from the beginning, not as a savior, but as a partner. And yet, Lydia couldn't resist the urge to steal a moment in the midst of the celebration. She took the microphone and, in a voice imbued with false sweetness, gave a speech in which she claimed to have always trusted that Hannah would find her way. Many of those present, familiar with the story, barely concealed wry smiles. Hannah, far from being enraged, listened to those words with a serenity that disarmed any attempt at manipulation. She no longer needed to unmask Lydia. Reality itself did that for her. That night, with heartfelt toasts and laughter that held no venom, she understood that her victory lay not in exposing her family's cruelty, but in having built a present where that cruelty no longer held any power. After the wedding, Hannah began to notice how her relationship with her family was transforming. It wasn't that Lydia or Marion had actually changed, but the way she received their comments no longer had the same effect. The patronizing remarks that had once pierced her self-esteem now bounced off like raindrops off a sturdy umbrella. William used to remind her not to waste energy trying to prove anything to those who never wanted to see her happy, and those words became an anchor whenever the old insecurity tried to creep in. At family gatherings, Hannah no longer sat in the corner chair. She sat wherever she wanted, and her very presence conveyed that she wasn't willing to accept secondary roles imposed by others. Over time, even some family members who had usually ignored her began to approach her in a different way. Not because they had suddenly discovered her worth, but because the confidence she projected forced them to see her differently. Hannah understood. People change their behavior when they realize they can no longer control others. That clarity filled her not with resentment, but with a firm calm. She no longer expected apologies or acknowledgement. All she needed was to continue building her life with the same dignity she had regained that night. In that certainty, she found a kind of freedom she had never felt before, the freedom to be seen without having to beg for attention or validation. Fueled by the confidence she'd been cultivating, Hannah decided to focus fully on her career at the publishing house. For years, she'd accepted a secondary role, convinced she didn't deserve to aspire to more. But now that inner voice had changed. She proposed new projects, dared to lead meetings, and even spearheaded the publication of an emerging author whom others had dismissed. When that book became an unexpected success, Hannah received recognition that depended not on surnames or social connections, but on her own work. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to celebrate without the shadow of family comparisons. William stood by her side, proud, reminding her that this achievement was hers and no one else's. The impact of that change was even reflected in how she handled interactions with Lydia and Marion. When they came to her with comments disguised as advice, Hannah no longer felt the need to justify herself. She responded calmly or often simply with silence, making it clear that she didn't need to engage in power games. This attitude disconcerted those who were used to seeing her react with insecurity. The real victory wasn't proving she was better than them, but showing that she could live in peace no matter what they said. It was in that serenity that she found a form of strength she had never known, the strength of not needing anyone's approval but her own. As time passed, Hannah and William began to build not only a relationship, but a shared vision of the future. They talked about trips they wanted to take, projects they wanted to undertake together, and even a house with a garden where they could receive friends without protocol or appearances. These conversations, which once would have seemed like distant dreams, were now concrete plans that filled her days with excitement. Hannah discovered that it wasn't about someone coming to complete her, but about walking alongside someone who enhanced what already existed within her. That certainty gave new meaning to everything she had experienced: the humiliations, the tears, even the painful memory of the table of the rejected. At the same time, her relationship with her family had become a backdrop, no longer central to her thoughts. She attended some meetings, yes, but she did so from an emotional distance that allowed her to observe without feeling hurt. Lydia continued to play her role as the successful sister, and Marion continued with her lines laced with elegant venom. But now Hannah saw them as predictable characters in a play that no longer included her. This distance wasn't indifference, but an act of self-care. She understood that she could love her family without accepting that they defined who she was. That perspective became her strongest shield, and it was what allowed her to take increasingly firm steps forward. As the months passed, Hannah began to experience a peace she'd never felt before. She woke up without feeling like she had to justify herself to anyone, and her days were filled with decisions born from her own desires. That autonomy was reflected in her everyday life, from choosing a new style of furniture for her home to turning down social engagements she'd previously accepted under pressure. The memory of the rejected table was no longer an open wound, but a scar that drove her to value the freedom she'd gained. What had once made her feel invisible now served as a reminder of how much she'd grown. This transformation wasn't loud or in need of witnesses. It was a profound change noticeable in the way she walked, the way she smiled, and the calm with which she faced challenges. Even the most painful memories of her childhood and youth began to take on a different tone. She no longer saw them as evidence that she hadn't been enough, but as stages that had prepared her to recognize her true worth. Looking back, she realized that Lydia's contempt and Marion's condescension had never been about her, but reflections of her own insecurities and obsessions with appearance. That realization allowed her to free herself from a weight she'd been carrying for years. Now she could remember without resentment, like someone flipping through a difficult but necessary book. It was a lesson she shared with those she crossed paths with, because she understood that her experience could inspire others not to accept the role. Others try to impose on them. This new inner balance led Hannah to open herself up to new connections outside her usual circle. She began participating in literary gatherings, not as a mere spectator, but sharing her own ideas about the value of personal stories. There she discovered a group of women who, like her, had been burdened with unfair labels: the too independent, the spinster, the nonconformist. Finding these voices comforted her, because she understood that her experience was not an isolated case but part of a silent chain of daily resistance. Little by little, these gatherings became a space of shared strength, where pain was transformed into motivation and shame into pride. William supported her every step of the way, discreetly accompanying her, never trying to be the protagonist in what was a deeply personal process. He knew that true love wasn't about saving someone, but about holding a space where that person could grow without fear. Hannah valued that attitude more than anything else because it contrasted with her family's constant attempts to pigeonhole her or control her choices. Now she had someone at her side who pushed her forward without shackles, and that gave her the strength to continue expanding her horizons. Thus, what had begun as an act of humiliation at her sister's wedding had transformed, over time, into the starting point of a life that no longer asked permission to be lived. Over time, Hannah realized that her story shouldn't remain just a personal experience, but could become a driving force for others. She decided to start writing articles and short essays about the weight of family and social expectations on women's lives. At first, she shared them in small circles, but they soon began to circulate far beyond her imagination. She received messages from strangers thanking her for putting into words feelings they themselves hadn't dared to confess. This gave her a new certainty. Her voice, which had been so often silenced or ridiculed, held real value for those seeking encouragement in the midst of darkness. This unexpected visibility led her to give talks in community spaces and local universities, where she recounted how she had learned to confront humiliation and rebuild her life from scratch. She didn't present herself as an expert or a perfect example, but as an ordinary person who had experienced what many experience in silence. Her sincerity became her hallmark, and people connected with her precisely because she didn't speak from a pedestal, but from vulnerability. If this story touched you in any way, share it. It may reach someone who needs to hear that they are not alone in their struggle. Hannah's independence reached a point where it was no longer just about resisting her family's pressure, but about building a life on her own foundation. Literary events, published articles, and community talks began to provide her with a network of contacts and friends who recognized her for who she was, not for what she lacked. That circle became a healthy refuge free from comparisons, where she could be herself without masks or labels. There she found unexpected collaborations, artists, academics, young people seeking guidance. Each encounter reinforced the idea that her story of humiliation transformed into strength had a real impact beyond her personal experience. Lydia and Marion watched from a distance, unable to deny the obvious. They tried on more than one occasion to reimpose their narrative, but they found a steadfast Hannah, who no longer reacted to their provocations. The difference was that now she didn't need to shout or defend herself. The course of her life spoke for her. William, always by her side, became a witness and companion in that evolution, reminding her not to be sidetracked by voices that no longer held power. What had once been a wound exposed to everyone had become a story of overcoming challenges that inspired others and, above all, kept Hannah connected to what was most essential, her own dignity. As time passed, Hannah learned to look at her past without the weight of shame. That night at Lydia's wedding ceased to be a bleeding wound and transformed into a turning point, a mark on the calendar that signaled the beginning of her true life. Sometimes, remembering the table of rejects or the bouquet caught in her dress, she felt a pang in her chest, but immediately the image of William reaching out to her would come, changing the direction of her destiny with a simple gesture. That dual memory became a symbol, humiliation and rescue coexisting in the same scene, reminding her that even in the darkest moments, a spark of dignity can be ignited. In the calm of her new home, Hannah realized that she no longer lived to prove anything to Lydia, nor to meet Marion's impossible standards. Her life was defined by her own choices: which books to publish, to whom to open the doors of her house, how to maintain the peace she had built. That freedom was a silent but powerful triumph, much stronger than any social recognition. She felt she had closed a cycle, not because her family had changed, but because she had learned not to give them the power to decide who she was. And in that peace, she found the true meaning of having survived the night that tried to break her. On the anniversaries of her wedding to William, Hannah often laughed when she remembered how it all began in the middle of a night that promised to be her downfall. That irony strengthened her. The humiliation Lydia planned as a spectacle became the seed of her greatest victory. With each passing year, that date ceased to be a reminder of a wound and transformed into an intimate celebration of resilience. Most importantly, when she looked around, she saw a life that depended not on the acceptance of others, but on the self-love and mutual respect she had learned to cultivate. That transformation also gave her a new way of seeing revenge. She understood that it wasn't about returning harm or publicly exposing those who had slighted her, but about living so fully that her enemies had no choice but to confront their own smallness. The best revenge, she understood, was the tranquil silence of a life well lived, and by embracing that idea, she definitively left behind the need for approval, replacing it with the certainty that her story had value in itself. That was true victory, having taken pain and turned it into the foundation for a dignified and free existence. Over the years, Hannah understood that her story wasn't just that of a woman rescued from public humiliation, but of someone who learned to rescue herself. Her life with William became a refuge and a starting point, but the essential aspect lay in the perspective she had learned to have on herself. No longer that of a hopeless cause, but that of a woman who had transformed pain into strength and ridicule into dignity. Every project, every friendship, and every peaceful day were silent proof that the best revenge lay not in proving anything to her family, but in living fully. Thus, the night that began with cruel laughter ended rewritten as the seed of a new life, an eternal reminder that dignity is not something you ask for, it is something you earn.